Is someone going to introduce us? Okay. Just checking.
Just waiting a moment for a few people at least to filter in.
Well, there's no one in the center square.
Oh, so if no one's here, I can talk.
Yeah.
Oh, and slump.
So you still want to do the reading at the beginning, right, Leslie?
Yeah, whatever works out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a
5
good
minutes.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rachel, Anna.
Well, let me get started so I can get out of the way. Hello, everyone. My name is Bashan. I'm a host for Politics and Prose. Welcome to another PNP Live. Before we get into the event, just a couple of quick items. The first is that throughout the event, if you'd like to ask a question of our featured author, but also any of our welcome guests here, you can place it in the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen. We ask you place it there to help facilitate the question and answer period so we don't have to go looking for them. Aside from that, in the chat section, you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase a copy of our featured work, Admit This to No One. Of course, we highly encourage you to do so and thank you for your patronage. There it is. Your patronage helps continue to allow us to bring you these live events. Admit This to No One is a collection of stories that show us how Washington, D.C.'s true currency is power, but power is inextricable from oppression. D.C. is a city divided, not just by red or blue, right or left, but black and white, segregated by income and opportunity, but also physically by bridges and rivers and police vehicles. Leslie Pietrzyk casts an unflinching and exacting gaze on her characters as they grapple with the ways they have upheld white supremacy and misogyny. Ms. Pietrzyk, her short fiction has appeared in the Gettysburg Review, the Iowa Review, New England Review, The Sun, Plowshares, River Styx, the Washington Post Journal, Tri-Quarterly, and Shenandoah. She holds a bachelor's in English creative writing from Northwestern University and a master in fine arts in creative writing from American University. And she's teaching at the master's writing program at Johns Hopkins University, as well as the low-res MFA program at Converse College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She is joined today by, in no particular order, Ms. Paula Whyman, who is the author of the Link story collection, You May See a Stranger, which won the Towson Prize for Literature. Her work has appeared in places like McSweeney's Quarterly, Virginia Quarterly Review, Plowshares, The Washington Post, and on NPR. She is vice president of the McDowell Fellows Executive Committee and a fellow of McDowell, Yaddo, VCCA, and the Studios of Key West. She has received 2 Maryland State Arts Council Individual Artist Awards, and she is editor-in-chief of Scoundrel Time Literary Journal. Also joining us today is Carolyn Parkhurst. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 4 novels, including The Dogs of Babel and Lost and Found. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, and The Rumpus. Without any further ado, ladies, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are really excited to be here. Paula and I have known Leslie a long time. We met her separately, but we've both known her since like the early 2000s. And we were at one point all in a writing group together. We thought we would begin by having Leslie read a little bit. So do you want to go ahead, Leslie?
No, I don't think so. No, just yes, I would love to read. Thank you for asking me. I'm just going to read a really short 5 minutes and 24 seconds section, which is the opening of the title story, Admit This to No One. And just because I love point of view, there's sort of 2 little points of view. We start in sort of an omniscient point of view, and then we go into a character. So this is just a little taste of Admit This to No One. Official DC is mindful of insignificant beginnings, of small decisions that escalate into epic downfalls. 5 men break into an office one June night in 1972. A pretty girl wears a blue dress from the Gap. Another pretty girl stuffs incriminating documents inside her boots, and a different pretty girl splashes her way into the tidal basin. A woman utters the phrase basket of deplorables during a campaign speech. A man is photographed sitting in an Abrams tank. Someone adds an E to potato at an elementary school spelling bee. It's announced that a mission is accomplished. On July 25th, 2019, a phone call is placed to Ukraine. A mayor waits in a room at the Vista International Hotel. Distressed at losing Iowa, a man howls into a microphone. Read my lips, someone suggests. People pose for photos on the monkey business. Poof. To claw back, if you can, is to arrive at a place that can never be the place you were, is to dwell within the shadowy gloom of what if, is to watch the world spin without you, after all. What's the cleanup now? Mary Grace thinks as a phone number flashes across the screen on her car dashboard. She's stuck in traffic on the 14th Street Bridge, headed to, of all places, the mall at Pentagon City to meet with her personal shopper. In another city, it might be embarrassing to be dressed by someone, but here, with little room for error, she'll take the imprimatur of Mira's excellent taste. Let Mira dash around the store collecting jewel-toned dresses as if they're seashells, allowing Mary Grace to wobble out judgment before capitulating. They're pushing these sleeves this year? Really? Okay, you know best. Mira understands perfectly how Mary Grace walks the endless wire of looking good without looking like she's working to look good. Half the women on Capitol Hill use a team of Miras to create the illusion that a powerful woman can casually stride into a room. No one in Mary Grace's position ignores a ringing phone. The car's moving inch by half inch, so how easy to accept the call and calmly announce, "You've reached me," her signature greeting since she started working with the speaker. And just to say, that's the Speaker of the House, who's an imaginary person, not Nancy Pelosi. Since she started working with the speaker when she was young and still dressed herself. They should know who they're calling, she figures, so start them off base. 4 buzzes, then a voicemail will grab the call. She senses bad news. That familiar chill ripples the back of her neck. Iciness tickles her toes. Bad news is her specialty, is why her job exists, why she exists, to mop it all up, to polish it into good news. Bad news is an opportunity. Who would ever tire of opportunity? To Mary Grace, bad news is perversely good news because it's a sure indication that she's needed and that she's important, that she's powerful. The river below churns choppy and brown after last night's storm. So much lightning, she got out of bed and stood at her balcony, watching the jagged shards slice up the sky. Peaceful to watch rage storm itself out, and interesting now to contemplate how the river ends up roiling the next day, all that rage dumped here. Several people drown in the Potomac annually, usually overconfident kayakers and hikers at Great Falls who ignore the warning signs advising against scrambling out on the slippery rocks for selfies. She's ready for that dang phone. "You've reached me," she says, now redirecting the trajectory of the car's inching, nosing it to the right lane and the eventual first exit in Virginia. Whatever it is, she's needed. Whatever it is, she's in charge. "Oh my God," she says immediately, then again and again and again and again. The lightning strikes sizzle, the whooshing suck of the currents, these words no one should hear. She crushes the brake pedal, barely avoiding smashing the Toyota in front of her, and automatically raises one hand as an "I'm sorry," though it's likely they won't spot that via the rear view. Likely they don't realize how close they've come to an annoying fender bender. The mental list collects, which should calm her: who to call, who to text, who to inform, who to delegate what to. This traffic is horrific, likely sticking her on this bridge for a good 20 minutes before she'll exit in Virginia and then circle back to DC via the other side of the bridge through different loops of snarl, crawling this goddamn car to GW Hospital. Mary Grace jams down the horn at the uptight Volvo SUV that refuses to let her squeeze by. Such a useless thought, but here it is. What if she had let the phone worry itself into silence?
All right.
That was
Thank you.
great.
That was great, Leslie. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a collection of stories, and some of them are linked and some of them are sort of standalone, but they all are linked by taking place in DC and being about sort of the larger, the city of DC, what it's like to be in, live in, work in DC. And the character that you just, whose point of view you were just reading, Mary Grace, is a particularly interesting character. The stories that are linked revolve around the speaker, and we get the point of view of two of his daughters, I think, but two daughters who barely know each other because he's had 4 wives and, several different, like totally separate families. And then Mary Grace is just the only one who knows how to take care of everything. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mary Grace and the character and how you came up with her and all that?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. I think Mary Grace, well, I love all my characters, but I really loved writing about Mary Grace because she works in this very intense environment, on Capitol Hill. She has worked with the speaker since she was very young, since the speaker was young. And the speaker is, I got to use like every single political, sexual scandal that existed and threw them all into this man, the speaker. And yet Mary Grace is someone he has never slept with or really even ever seen in that way. He has always seen that she has this kind of power, or that she could cultivate a certain type of power. And that power is the person who's behind the scenes, who never gets the glory, who is in the background, who sort of knows everything and tells nothing. And that I thought it would be very fascinating for the speaker, who has all these wives, who has a mess as a father in every possible way, has this one powerful woman who kind of is abetting him and helping him be the person he is, but who also kind of has that power over him, whether he would admit that or not. So I loved working with her and imagining what that would be like, because for me, actually, it would be very hard to remain in the shadows and feel power without, exercising it.
And you get the sense she's sort of given up everything for this job. Maybe she wouldn't have married or had children otherwise, but she certainly didn't when this became the path of her life. And, one of my favorite scenes is this flashback where he's, like, everyone thought he was going to win the presidential election at some point, like 30 years in the past. And then he screwed it up for the first time he left behind his family to go sleep with some random woman, and then she got pregnant and so forth. And that's a pattern that's repeated. And that's one of the few times we see her get mad at him. And, it's like the only time the mask slips, it feels like.
Right. And that was actually, that's in this story that I just read, Admit This to No One. That's where she's thinking back as she drives to the hospital. And that was a hard scene to write. My organizing principle throughout writing this whole book was to choose things that were uncomfortable and hard. Like, what's the worst thing the character can do? What's the unexpected, awful thing? What's going to make the reader uncomfortable? What makes me uncomfortable? And so to imagine her kind of yelling at the speaker, her boss, and expressing this disappointment, sort of maybe for the first and potentially only time, that seemed like something that would really make her very uncomfortable. And yet that kind of exercising that kind of rage actually does help her see the kind of power that she does have.
I would like it if you would talk a little bit about the theme of estrangement, because it seems to me that just about every relationship in this story, every person in this story is estranged from someone else in the story. And it's not only the speaker and his wives, which you don't really see too much of, but mainly the speaker and his daughters. Those are the primary relationships. There's Lexi, who was the first one who was left. And then there's Madison, who is a teenager when the book opens, whose voice is incredible. And I want to talk about that too. But the men and women are estranged from each other, fathers and daughters, mothers and daughters. and female friends. The female friendships in this book are particularly fraught. There are high school friends who come back or college friends who come back, and the characters are saying nasty things about each other, and sort of off stage. And I wondered, to me, in a way that reflects something about what we think we know about the political relationships in Washington. So there's a nice layering effect to it. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think from early on, just like Lexi, the speaker's oldest daughter, and his favorite, he says, whether she is or not, whether that's truthful or not, we're not sure whether she believes it or not, but sort of his favorite, and maybe the one girl who broke his heart, even though he stays estranged from her. Anyway, she is obsessed with the Prodigal Son story, which is from the Bible, where the two brothers get their inheritance. The one brother goes off and spends his inheritance, wine, women, and song, and then comes home while the dutiful brother has stayed toiling away. And the father's like, "Oh, great, you're back." And it's like that always challenged me. And so I think maybe my whole writing career has been trying to understand the Prodigal Son story and forgiveness and returning home and what that means. And so that's sort of one level that the estrangement works, is just my own personal obsession, I guess you could call it. But then also in thinking about Washington and that saying, which I quote in the book a couple of times, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. This idea that you can't trust anybody. And the fact that the two college friends that Paula is referring to in Hat Trick, they get together because the one wants to use the other to help her get a job. So that things are like so transactional in Washington. And I know obviously not, although I did pay Paula and Carolyn $2,000 each to host this. So, a little bit of transaction there, but
I didn't get my check yet.
It's in the mail. That people here kind of have an armor, and that they don't want to admit they're hurt. They don't want to admit that they need people. They don't want to admit that they care, and that sort of solid shell is the kind of thing that can sort of lead you to just say, well, she left, whatever, I'll just find somebody else. I'll do something else. There's always something else, kind of always on the prowl, the move upward, the move to a new, better job. That's a very cynical view. And obviously I know everybody who's watching is not like that. And that's why I like to say that this is sort of my view of official Washington, not necessarily the people who really live here.
Now the publication comes at an interesting time because you have just left the DC area to move away after how many years?
Oh my God, like 30 years.
Yeah. And so I'm curious about your experience of living in and around DC. You grew up in the Midwest, and DC must have been a shock to some degree. It's just a very different place to move to. And I'm curious about that experience, and also whether you just left, so I'm not expecting you to have tons of thoughts about it, but has it given you any different perspective?
Yeah. I think so. I grew up in Iowa in a college town, but even so, and even though I had a perfectly fine childhood, and Iowa City is a really lovely college town, I just always knew I was going to live on the East Coast. I just sort of knew that. So it wasn't a surprise to me that I eventually ended up here. What was sort of surprising as I was sort of working on this book really intently over the past year is kind of how much I've absorbed from living here, even though I have never technically worked on Capitol Hill. I don't go canvas photos. I don't really do a lot of the things that these people do. For a long time, it's not that I didn't care about politics, but I was not active in politics and thought, well, one or the other, they're both shits anyway, so whatever. But then, I started caring much more deeply. So it was surprising to me as I was coming up with details and thinking about this city, and it's like, wow, this life, there are so many unwritten rules in Washington, as there are in any culture. But it's like, I know that, like, one of the points of pride is that I know how to work Rock Creek Parkway, going up it during rush hour, like that. I know that, like, what an insider to know things like that, or the way you stand on escalators, just things like that. And so being away and being in a new place, suddenly all my knowledge, 30 years of knowledge, is useless, literally useless. And I have to try and understand this new place at that level, which, technically should be like a really fun challenge, but also is like, oh my God, that's so much work. It took me 30 years to understand Washington, and now this. And one thing that truly surprised me, because I knew kind of things I would miss about the DC area and, prepped mentally. But one thing that shocked me is, I think I was listening to the news or something. They made reference to, I think, a protest or something that was being planned for Washington. And I thought, oh, I don't live there anymore. I mean, I'm sure I wouldn't even have gone to this protest, but just this idea of where I lived is like one of the most important places in the world. Not my house, not Alexandria, but like just being in an important place. I never thought that I cared about that, but it felt like kind of a loss that I had not expected. But living here is very lovely, and people are nice, weather's great. I want you all to move down here, but leave your uptight Washington ways behind, because we don't want to ruin Winston-Salem, but it is a great place. It was time to move. 30 years is a long time.
Well, what do you wish more people understood about DC?
It depends on how cynical I am, and I'm pretty cynical right now. I think one thing that I find fascinating is that everybody always wants newcomers. They always want to elect newcomers, like, oh, this newcomer is going to change everything. It's like, oh my God, if you lived here, you would know that no newcomer ever can do anything so far, except, almost wreck democracy, but whatever. But just this idea that this is a place where relationships are important, where who you know is important, things that are whispered are important, and to just be a newcomer blundering around probably isn't going to work. I remember somebody telling me he worked for the government, and his favorite quotation was, well, a politician comes and goes every 4 years, but a bureaucrat is forever. And so this idea that there is something here that is hard to just change, and that the something here is not evil. It just literally is not evil. Right. It's not saintly either. It's kind of a machinery that keeps things going. And I love that people don't think that way, and that only cynical people who lived here for 30 years see things like that. So
I remember being on vacation once, and someone looked at my car and said, oh, they have license plates in Washington, D.C. The city, a lot of people live there. It was just like,
yeah.
baffled by what people's ideas of it. It's like people who think of Hollywood as being, movie stars wall to wall or something, I loved what you said about making things uncomfortable. And, one of the ways you did that was with various interactions that had, racial undertones that were just very awkward. A lot of the stories deal with what I would call white people making things weird, where they're like well-meaning white people who are not necessarily racist or try not to be, but, they sort of don't know what they're supposed to do. But, they recognize racism, and they recognize they have some privilege, and maybe they can do something to help, but they go about it all wrong. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought maybe you could talk about that a little.
Yes, I will talk about that. What I did at a certain point, and sort of independent of this book, I was just working on some stories, and I was thinking about my own sort of, I hate saying journey, but sort of, I guess, education about learning about the things that I didn't notice growing up in Iowa, or, going to college, like all the things I, white woman, didn't notice. And so I made this list. I literally wrote down a list of various microaggressions that I perpetrated or that I witnessed, or transgressions, like things that all involved me in some way. So everything involved me. Well, except I never shot a dog. That didn't really involve me, but in the story. But and I looked at that list and it was like, oh wow, like, well, it was a long list. And boy, that would be scary to write about that. And so instantly as a writer, when you think that would be scary to write about, you have to plunge in. And so I thought, I'm going to try doing this and see what happens. And so those stories, the ones about, white women with good intentions and suburban people, those all, for the most part, have some basis in something I have done or seen or witnessed. And it wasn't necessarily that I'm writing to say, oh, look, I'm so naughty. Now I'm confessing, I'm admitting this. And that's why it had to be uncomfortable. That's why it couldn't just be, look, I used to think this and now I don't. And look how great I am. So I wasn't writing those stories at all to seem like, oh, look, good for her for studying this stuff. I certainly wasn't writing those stories to educate anybody, because that is not my place to do that. I think I was writing those stories to examine my own hypocrisy, my own role in being complicit in, a power structure that has treated me pretty well, and then so I knew that they had to be uncomfortable, and then I had to fictionalize, these things aren't exactly as they unfolded, because most things in my real life are pretty boring. There's like a spark for something and then I make it worse. And so my premise was, okay, I did this thing at the grocery store. How can I make it worse? How can I make it harder? How can I make it more uncomfortable? And then kind of also my goal was to make it a little uncomfortable for readers to sort of see that and say, oh, did I do that? And to never, and I felt like if I'm hard on myself, then that maybe gives me license to be a little bit mean to readers, or not mean, trying to open eyes a little bit, I guess, or not.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Paula.
Well, I was going to say, sort of coming off of that, there's a very sharp sense of humor in this book because there are a lot of dark events that occur, but the humor sort of points that up. And I wanted to know if that was an intent of yours, or did you intentionally leaven it with humor, or is that just naturally the way you look at things?
Probably many factors, including I think so many of the writers I know and hang out with in the DC area are the most hilarious people I have ever met, including these two. And so like being around people who really know how to be funny and laugh and use humor effectively in their own work, I think that some of that has rubbed off on me. And I definitely think when you're writing and you're sort of you're writing a story where you're calling someone kind of all you people in the suburbs are racist. Like when you're saying that, you really don't want to say that, because people will be maybe turned off and not want to read. So you have to try and find that way to, lure people into reading, to use humor. Leaven is a good word, to use that humor to help ease people into it. So that's sort of the like, oh, look, this story's funny. Oh, this is funny. Oh, wait. Oh my God, she's writing about me. Oh, crap. So
yeah, I definitely hope you never try to analyze my clothing or my coffee mugs, is all I can say.
We're glad you're on our side, Leslie. I think when Paula and I had a conversation about what we were going to talk about, that was a conclusion we came to, is that we're glad you like us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a good art friend. I'm a good art friend.
Yes, you are. Absolutely.
This is really a book that rewards multiple readings, these stories too, because when I was reading through it multiple times before this event, and I was noticing more and more, for instance, the way you use clothing in this really brilliant way to characterize people. And sometimes it's to characterize the person who's describing what somebody else is wearing, and sometimes it's not. But there's a lot of humor and a lot of very sharp commentary, like social commentary in that. The class differences that are pointed up, and I just thought that was really well done. And I wondered if you did that on purpose. At times I felt like, I don't know, when you watch the movie The Godfather and you see Diane Keaton's wardrobe change as her character evolves, in some ways this made me think of that, because the wardrobe was handled so carefully.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting is when you're thinking about sort of power and the way people present themselves, like clothing is such a huge part of that. Like I chose to wear this, and my favorite bracelet for this, it's powerful. And I chose what to wear to present a certain image. And everybody does that. Even if you're choosing a ratty t-shirt, you're still choosing a ratty t-shirt. And what do those choices mean about you? What are you trying to say with your clothing choices? And then especially in Washington, where things can be very guarded and you don't want to tip your hand, and there's so much nuance, and like I said, unwritten rules, clothing is super important. And even if it's just like, I have to wear the same clothing that everybody else is wearing to fit in. And then writing wise, I will confess that I have a hard time writing physical descriptions of people. I just don't enjoy it. I just don't think I'm good at it. And so often I will choose to write about clothing, because then it's like, oh, I described them. I did my job check. I did my job, but I don't have to write about somebody's face or eyebrows or something. And then also, if you want to be a little bit of a procrastinator, it's like, oh, well, somebody's wearing a dress. Okay, what kind of dress? Think about it. Go look online, try and find the dress, describe that dress. I was joking with somebody that like any piece of furniture or any item of clothing that is described, you probably can buy online because I have looked it up before describing it.
A sort of character prototype that I feel like pops up in like all of your books is sort of a woman who's a mess, like the opposite of Mary Grace. I feel like there are, in this case, it would probably, I'm talking about Lexi mostly, but there may be others, but, women who just cannot get their act together for whatever reason. And I'm interested in, and they're alienating people around them. They're making bad decisions about love and work and everything else. And I wondered what you might say about that.
Well, I think I don't want to say I envy those people, because they end up badly and bad things happen to them. But I feel like I'm the opposite type of person, very organized, reliable, responsible. Like I was all set up for this event early. I was stressing out because I couldn't find my link. And it was like 20 minutes before I had to be there. And I was like, my God, where's my link? So I am not at all like those women. And so I think that's why I'm fascinated by them. What does it mean if you're the kind of person who can just collapse? And then how do people react to you? Because not to sound like we're in therapy or something, but like as somebody who's very responsible, everybody expects that of you. And so it's like, oh, Leslie will go pick up the whatever, or she'll do this, or she'll be on time. Let's ask her to do this because, it will get done well. So it's kind of tempting to imagine, what if I just didn't? Like, what would that be like? It's so different from how I live and how I feel able to live, that I think it's kind of intoxicating. And it's kind of a weird power. And trust me, these women, the messy women I'm writing about, would never see it this way, because their lives are, bad things happen to them. But isn't that kind of a power to just say, I give up, I can't do it. Fix me, take me, whatever. I just can't do it. It's a weird way of co-opting somebody else to your side. I mean, not a healthy way. I'm not saying that at all.
Well, I wanted to bring up the teenage voices in this book because I've also seen that in some of your other work, that your teenagers are spot on, in my opinion. And well, there's the teenage Madison who opens the book at dinner in the fancy restaurant in the Kennedy Center, not the cafeteria. and
God forbid.
Yeah. And her whole demeanor, her whole attitude toward everyone and everything is just so incredibly 15-year-old girl. And then there's a later story. Well, there are a couple of later stories with teenage boys. Again, same sort of thing, the mannerisms, the expressions. And I wondered if there is a particular age that you're drawn to, that maybe this is the same with all writers, that we have a particular point in time or age that we're all drawn to in our work. And I was wondering if the teenager is that for you.
Yeah, I do love writing about that age. It's just really fun. I love this idea that somebody is both independent and totally dependent still, that someone is trying to break free. Somebody thinks they know all the answers, and of course they don't. Somebody is ripe for a lesson, but also ripe to give someone else a lesson. And I'm someone who really likes writing unreliable and voicey characters. And so a teenager is totally unreliable. I mean, obviously, I know there are many I was a responsible teenager, but many teenagers lie and elude the truth in various ways. And I find that offers a lot of fodder for a book, for characters, and then being able to think about those voices. And then when I'm thinking about power, it's sort of, you think about kind of a teenage girl. I mean, she has no power really, because she can't vote, she doesn't have a lot of money. But in a way, a young girl always has a lot of power, not necessarily in the right ways, and she certainly doesn't necessarily know how to use it or what she's using it for, but suddenly to be aware of this kind of sexual power that she may have, I think that's very fraught and uncomfortable for everybody, and for her too, to suddenly see that you have this power over men. Like, what do you do with that, And then it's so fleeting, then it's gone. Then you're, 200 years old and nobody cares.
I am interested in hearing about how you decided on the ordering of the stories and the selection of, why you decided on some story. I mean, they're all linked thematically, but why some are linked in terms of story and characters, and why some are standalone, and just how you decided about ordering and selection of these particular stories.
Yeah, that's always hard, because my approach just is to write a bunch of stuff and then assume it will all work out somehow at some point. And always forgetting, no, I have to make it work out at that point. It's not going to just, fall into place. So this book actually parts of it came from a novel that was going to be about a tangled political family. And I was working on that novel in 2015 and just kind of writing about the characters and enjoying it and not worrying too much about plot, even though I noticed there was no plot. And that was stressing me out a little bit. And then Donald Trump got elected. And the last thing I wanted to do was be immersed in a fictional world. And I wasn't sure if readers would want to read that. So I abandoned the book. And it was one of those moments where the moment I decided was like, oh, yes, that's the right decision. Thank goodness. So no regrets. I abandoned it with no regrets. But then sort of before the pandemic, I just sort of thought, well, I have some stories from that book and I have some other stories. Let me just cram them all together into a book of stories and see what happens. And it was actually the editor at Unnamed Press who read the stories and said, I think this could be like a bigger arc. I think there could be more to this. I think this could be about Washington. And I said, that sounds like a lot of work. But it was interesting because, you know, I had that original vision of this family in a more plotted novel. Then the pandemic happened, and, you know, nobody wanted to publish a book then. So I was kind of left alone in the pandemic with a bunch of random stories, some half-finished things from the novel. And I thought, let me think about this more. And I started putting it all together and sort of seeing the conversation and the themes that could arise. And then when putting everything together in the end, you know, you sort of want to, you know, there's two stories on a bridge. Don't put those next to each other. I always knew I wanted to start where I started with this get together at the Kennedy Center, which sort of puts into motion the linked part of the story where something happens to the speaker. And then I liked how I like how I did the ending, which is really the big core, sort of like a novella, but separate stories following through after what happens at the Kennedy Center, all in this big chunk of time. And trying to, yeah, it was really hard. I definitely switched things around a lot and took some things out, and then had to write some things at the very end to fill in gaps. So yes, I believe in writing as if it will all work out in the end, even though it doesn't. Like, you make it work in the end with a lot of work.
And just because people are always interested, and I'm always interested, titles. Did it always have this title? Did it?
No.
Yeah.
No. In fact, I always thought I was very bad at titles. So in recent years, I started really working to try and understand how to title things. And I get to do my show and tell. This book originally, when it was just random short stories, I did think it was going to be about power. And I remembered way back when in high school, I had a government class from this, I'll just say, lunatic teacher who was so cynical, and he kept quoting to us constantly, like, absolute power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's like, I'm 16, I don't know what that means. And we had this book to read, and it was called Who Really Runs America? This, like, I'm in high school, this is like a book for adults, and it's like from the 1970s. It's just this crazy book about who really runs America. And yet that was all those things were kind of subversive in my mind of like, well, I thought the president ran America. Is that not true? Who does run America? So I just sort of a little foundation. So fast forward, I originally wanted to call this book Corruptible after that quote. And I was trying to write a story where I could, I don't know, maybe with a high school teacher quoting that to everybody. And that never worked out. And then when I did get finally the contract for actually it was before the contract. It was a certain point where early on the editor was like, well, we'll have to get rid of that title. Corruptible is a terrible title. I'm like, oh, okay. And so I was kind of rereading. And then the story I read from Admit This to No One has a moment where the speaker uses that phrase, that he would admit this to no one. And when I saw that, I was like, I think that could be it's a kind of a cool title, and it could be something to write toward. So as I worked on the stories, like, what are the things that people don't admit? Like, what are the secrets that people carry every single day? So I find for myself, having a solid title about halfway through a long project is really helpful to kind of write toward those bigger themes. I mean, it doesn't always work that way, but I was happy to have that title. It became very important. Oh, and I was very happy too, you know, how usually the editor is like, well, send me a list of ideas. And it's like, I have one idea. I hope you like it. She's like, I love it. Perfect. It's like, yes.
Well, yeah. I was thinking about, Carolyn mentioned we were all in a writing group together a long time ago. And that writing group had a lot of rules, and so many rules. And Leslie was like the overlord, keeper of the rules. She was the queen bee of the writing group. So I wondered if you have rules for your own writing. And do you have pet peeves when you're reading other people's work?
let's see, one rule is to never say anything bad about other writers on something that's being taped and is live on YouTube. But so that's a good rule. I do have a lot of rules for my writing, and it seems that often what happens is that in a long project, I'll come up with kind of an overriding rule for the whole book. Like for me, as I said, this rule for this book definitely was, it has to be uncomfortable. Anytime I was stuck with a plot or where to take someone, it was like, what is the most awful thing that could happen right now? What is the worst thing they could do? What is the thing that I just don't want to write? What is so uncomfortable? It's like, and then it would hit me and it's like, okay, well, that's the thing. That's the rule. Let's see. I pet peeve with other writers. I don't know. It's so hard to write a book. I want to love all the books, and which I can't do, I know, but I do love that a writer has worked on a book for years, or that a story may be something so dear to them. And here it is on the page. Like I may not finish it, but I want to respect that effort. And those rules for that writing group were really good.
They were good rules. They were very good rules.
Kept us together.
I didn't mean to imply that they weren't.
But it is true. And I love rules. I love knowing what I'm supposed to do. And so I never did realize until much later how daunting it was for somebody to join the group. And I'd say, oh, and here's our rules. And it was like at least a sheet of paper.
Okay, people are asking what were the rules. It was just kind of like, don't flake out, like you can miss one once in a while. I mean, we were all women who had lives, at various times. If you have to travel or something, that's fine. But, try to make it was just about not missing meetings, about, sending your
written comments, not just marginal comments.
There may have been a
full written comment. Yeah, there might have been
a font suggestion. I probably still have them somewhere on my computer. They were, well, if there's anybody from Converse who has seen my guidelines for mentoring, which is like 8 pages long, they're probably like, oh yeah, I know exactly what kind of rules there were. It's like every possible thing you could think of was covered in those rules. That's why I like rules. They tell you what to do.
At some point,
aimed at making it professional, just so
that was the gist.
The last priority, that when you, like we each of us submitted like something every other month. So you had that slot and you did not miss that slot if it was at all possible. I mean, things happen. Like I said, it's not like there was no flexibility, but I think they were very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And while we're on questions, why don't we, I'm going to take a look at what questions have been asked in the Q&A section. All right. What will people in DC recognize in this book that others won't? And what will people outside DC learn about DC living?
I think that the sort of little DC details that people will notice might be one of my favorite things is how when I'm riding the metro at night and you look at the glass, and you're looking out the window, but you see a perfect reflection of everybody around you. You can stare at people without them knowing that you're staring. And I see all these people at night doing that. Well, this was before phones. Maybe they're all just looking at their phones, but the sort of little tricks like that. I don't know. Like it just was, it was very strange to me. Like I was saying, that these things were just so ingrained in me that in a way I can't even at this moment think of anything so unusual that, there's the DC secret that nobody will know about. Oh, I think there's little details about, if you go to a hockey game, you can spend, it's like, I don't know, $12 on bottomless popcorn. There's this giant bin of, not very good popcorn. And the reason it's bottomless is because you feel so sick of it, by the time you're halfway through. So little things like that, details about TJ Oshie and Alexander Ovechkin, who I'm hoping, might read this book and come up with some hockey tickets or the caricatures on the wall of the Palm restaurant. And then what was the second part? What would people who
don't live in DC? Wait, I have to go to answered questions. Hang on. What will people outside DC learn about DC living, and what would people in DC? I think you've kind of covered it. Recognize
Okay.
that others
Yeah.
won't. Yeah.
There's someone is asking, are there other books or movies about DC that inspired you or that showed you how not to portray the city?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I would have bet lots of money that I would never write a political book at all. And I barely even set stories in DC. You know, I would write about sort of suburbs or something, or vaguely Virginia. So this book is sort of a shock to me. And I think that when I decided I'm going to do this, you sort of start thinking, well, what are the other models? And there are a lot of funny books about DC, like Christopher Buckley, or I can't think of, I had some other name, humor, satire about DC, or books set in DC that aren't really about politics. But then it's really hard to write a political novel where you have to battle the stereotypes of the politician and what everybody thinks they know about politics and create people. And then you really have to think, well, what is the city? Because there's official DC, then there's the regular city. And I've decided to focus on official DC. And I wanted to be funny, but not satirical. And I didn't want to be earnest, and I didn't want to teach lessons. All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, which is not in DC, but a political novel, was a really good book that I loved. I actually really loved the TV show Veep, which gave me a lot of confidence. I mean, that's satirical, but also it's just so funny, and you just felt like that had to be true. Like it just all had to sort of be true. And I read the Washington Post religiously for 30 years, Washingtonian magazine. Those are sort of where I got my information, I guess. And it's just surprising living in DC, just being out in the world, how much stuff you pick up at parties or people you meet and so on.
So there was one question, what prompted you to move to Winston-Salem? And related, something that I also meant to bring up but forgot. Someone said, I love the dedication of the book and wondered if it was why you had to skip town. So can you tell us about the dedication and why you chose it and all of that?
I love the dedication. And for people who don't have their copy yet, I will read the dedication. This book is dedicated to everyone in DC who scanned the room during the party while asking me, so what do you do? This. And I don't know when my husband we were sort of riffing and joking about DC and how everybody asks what you do. And, you know, the minute you say you're like a writer, it's like, next, you know, it's classic. So he's like, you should put that in the dedication. I was like, oh my God, really? Oh yeah, do it. And then I remember I asked you guys what you thought, and you both said, oh, do it. So it's like, I'll do it. What the heck, you know? And that's not why I had to skip town, but it sort of is helpful to not be in town to know that. I don't know. You have to, I think between this cover, which I had nothing to do with, but which I love, and this kind of audacious, you know, in your face kind of picture, and then the dedication, which actually the book cover designer said inspired her. She's like, oh, I see what this book is doing. All right. I think I really wanted to set the tone early on. I know that people don't always read the dedication, but I knew that if anyone did, they would know what kind of book they were getting. And if they didn't want that book, put it down, you know, maybe pay for it, take it home, and then, but, you know, move along. And then as for leaving DC, that was a really hard decision, but it honestly was time. It was the right time. Where I live now, if you can imagine, there is no traffic. Every place I need to go is 10 minutes away, and there's a giant parking place waiting for me. Less expensive, less stressful, and also just kind of exciting to try something new and different. I mean, it's scary. It is scary. I will admit that. But y'all need to come down here. Come visit me.
This is a good one. You've mentioned your writing prompt group often, and did any of the characters spring for one of those sessions? So can you tell us a little bit about the writing prompt group for anyone who doesn't know?
Yes, the writing prompt group. We have been meeting for at least 10 years. We meet once a month, and we just have two open-ended prompts. They're just words, so open-ended. And we write for half an hour, and then we share or not. So it's a really good way to experiment and explore, like really low stakes writing. And so much of my writing practice now revolves around prompts, either with the group or sometimes I'll do them on my own. But I could go through here page by page, and I'd say like at least 50% of this book or scenes, moments were inspired by those really open-ended writing prompts. Like the very first story, which is set at the Kennedy Center, I think receipts and ticket were the words. And if you read it, you'll see those words in there, but you'll see that's not really about receipts and not really about tickets, but there we go. And the last story in the book has a number of writing prompts that I did during the pandemic when I was dying for Starbucks and dying to get out of the house and dying to be alone. I went to the Starbucks and then sat in my car in the parking lot and worked on little prompts to myself and sketched out a lot of this story just by coming up with words that I overheard on my little quick and scary journey into the Starbucks to get my eggnog latte.
That ties into another question, which is there a special place you liked to go write in DC during, presumably during non-pandemic times when you weren't limited to your car?
Yeah, I'm a big, I like to write at home, and then I'm a big person to do prompt writing at a Starbucks, at a coffee shop, various places like that, outdoor. Not one place. I think that would be hard for me to have like one place. So I float around between a number of coffee places. And then the prompt group was really good.
There's a question here asking if you could pick one high-profile Washington politician to read your book.
Oh no.
Who would it be?
Ooh, what a great and scary question. Wow, I admire them all so much, so it's really hard to choose. Let's see. Well, the obvious choice is anyone would want, Barack Obama to read their work. So that's the obvious choice. So I'll try and think of people in power right now. I don't know. At one point I gave Kellyanne Conway the finger at a baseball game, and I just don't know if she got my message. So I think that would be fun for her to read this book. To really get the message. I mean, she probably wouldn't even have to read very much to understand what I was doing. Yeah, that's a great question.
Someone is asking, in the link stories, there are timestamps like 2 years later or several years from now, and wondering why you decided to put those in.
Oh, well, because that's one of the hard things. Like, this is technically a book of short stories. So sometimes when I read a book of short stories, I just pick the fifth story and start reading there. So I had to imagine that people might not read in order, heathens that they are. So the timestamps are mostly in Madison's story. And I just wanted to make sure that people knew that she wasn't a 15-year-old girl going to the Palm with a lobbyist, that she was, more of an adult. And to sort of set her stories apart, there's no, when she's an older character, there's no dialogue tags, and so that's sort of her thing too. That's Madison's storyline. But a lot of things you choose to do really to kind of help the reader flow through the book and not get lost. And probably readers always, I get lost when I read and all the time. And so I try to be mindful of giving little hints as much as possible. And then the last story actually is set in the future, not like, you know, nobody's wearing silver jumpsuits or anything, but it's a few years from now. And that was actually kind of a fun challenge because they're at a protest. I had to kind of imagine a protest that sounded still relevant to a modern contemporary reader, but that also could still be ongoing in a few years. And so that's why I also wanted to make sure that it was clear this is a few years after these events have happened.
And I have one last question that I'd like to wrap up with, which is, do you have any secrets about this book?
Oh, I wonder what made Carolyn decide to ask that question, because it turns out I do have a secret about this book. And I'm so excited to share this with everybody because I have only told 1, 2, 3 people that I have done this. So nobody knows except those 3 people and now everybody. But if you happen to have a copy of the book with you, if you look at the acknowledgments on page 254, and you look at the first letter of every sentence, which is called an acrostic. So you're looking down, here's a little secret message. And maybe that's the person who I would like to read this book and see that, but I don't think that person ever would do any of those things.
That is excellent. I'm very glad. And for those of you who don't get it, you're just going to have to buy the book, obviously. I'm not going to say what the acrostic message is.
Thanks for asking, though.
And it is 6 o'clock, so I think it's about time to to wrap things up. But is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Leslie?
Yes, thank you to everybody. Nobody writes a book alone. It feels like you're all alone some of those times, but you have the support of all kinds of people in all kinds of ways, and that truly is the most powerful force that I know, is being a writer in the DC community, getting to share this with all of you and feeling all your attention and, dare I admit this, love. It's nice. Thank you. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you for inviting us to do it with you, Leslie. And it is such a great book. It really is. I highly recommend it, and not just because Leslie is a friend. It's really a great book.
Yeah,
I mean, I suspect the people who are here don't need to be convinced, but if anyone is wavering, you really should buy it and read it.
It's really a terrific book. And I'm sure Carolyn and I both read it multiple times, and each time there was more that came to the surface and more. It's a book that makes the reader feel smart because you notice so many intricacies, and I really appreciate that about it. Really appreciate the humor and the spot on characterizations. It was just really a pleasure to read.
Thank you.
So congratulations, Leslie, and thank you everyone for coming. And yes, yay, clap. Yeah.